The Pendletons are here. You're supposed to be on duty. Come on. You're supposed to be on guard. You'll get dismissed for sure. I can't believe this. You said you weren't even drunk. Wake up.
Why bother with something like this? Tasteless.
Oh, that might be worth checking out.
Dishonored's identity is distinct and ironically very clear. There are few games that are even within the same sphere as Arkane Studios' 2012 release. Often referred to as immersive sims, this subgenre of action games gives the player a tremendous number of options to utilize in order to complete their objectives. This style has become Arkane's primary design philosophy, and while their previous releases had a more general intended solution to gameplay scenarios, Dishonored is focused on making stealth the primary solution. Corvo, the game's protagonist, is highly capable as a clandestine assassin whose tiny crossbow and knife are more than enough to topple the leadership of Dunwall 2 times over. But do they truly deserve death? And could the citizens cope with repeated leadership changes amidst an apocalyptic plague event strangling the city? The player does get a decent look at that city. Dunwall has a wide range of residential, commercial, and industrial sectors that Corvo's escapades will eventually lead him through. Naturally, there will be a fair amount of time scuttling through similar-looking secure facilities, but that is to be expected when trying to depose key members of Dunwall's new leadership. Corvo is also a regular to the city's sewers, often returning to them when overland travel is too risky. There is often a surprising degree of variety within these environments, which is also true within the unique areas. From the start of the game, while the player is escaping prison, they will travel through a cell block, an exercise yard, and some administration facilities before finally making their way out of the door. This quality has been extended across all of the other scenarios, as a method to prevent the environments from becoming stale. Strange, then, that the player returns to the distillery district repeatedly during the first few scenarios. Without a doubt, the environment models and textures are phenomenal. Dishonored is almost a decade old at this point, and the tree right at the start of the game was the only poor environmental piece I could find. Any other criticisms I'd have for the environments would be nitpicks. It is odd that a wrench plague hit at the same time as the rat plague, or the solution to keeping pedestrian traffic down is to put these metal barriers in the streets, but these things are so minor that I doubt many others even noticed. Something that is more noticeable, though, are the character models. Dishonored has a collection of caricatures fulfilling every role within the plot. There are a lot of the same model floating around, and for whatever reason, most of the male characters have enormous hands. One of the more plot-relevant characters, Lord Pendleton, asks Corvo to help remove his elder twin siblings from their positions within Dunwall Parliament. Pendleton lacks investment in the plot without members of his family being targets somewhere down the line, so their existence isn't too bad, but I struggled to discern the High Overseer from Admiral Havelock. And there is another guard model that is also similar looking. Brawny, bald, white men who have an angry expression on their face make up a large chunk of Dunwall's armed forces, it seems. And their hands! Samuel's hands aren't huge like everyone else's. The diorama of Corvo beside a grave during the credits looks ridiculous because of how gargantuan his hands are. Is big hands an art style? How would they tie their shoes? Do Corvo's mega hands give him the ability to mega choke people? Corvo controls how any other first-person character does. The player somewhat controls his left and right hands independently, and don't have to worry about stamina bars or a clunky cover system. Running quickly is always available, but the noise will draw unwanted attention. Corvo has the ability to crouch down, which greatly increases his sneakiness, and is also able to lean around corners to get a better idea of the situation ahead. Being crouched behind pretty much anything is enough to be considered hidden a lot of the time, but there are occasions where the player is visible and they aren't aware. There are a lot of places to climb onto, and Corvo will happily mantle anything so long as the player mashes the spacebar when near it. He isn't capable of climbing sheer walls or onto barbed wire, but if it has a top, Corvo will get up there. If stealth fails, then combat is an option. While he is a competent swordsman, Corvo is also equipped with gadgets and magic. The pistol is basic, loud, but is capable of killing an opponent in one hit, so long as the spread doesn't whiff entirely. The crossbow can be loaded with regular bolts, knockout bolts, or incendiary bolts. A headshot from a regular bolt will kill the target, but any other hit isn't lethal. Knockouts are most useful when trying to avoid killing enemies, and incendiary bolts are only really useful against the enemies carrying explosive tanks. There is at least a question for pistols versus crossbows. The player can also find mines, grenades, and bottles of flammable liquid to throw at enemies, which sometimes leaves the enemies stumped when trying to find the player, and other times tells them exactly where the player is. Finally, the magic is okay. Possessing an enemy mostly leads to them killing themselves, and the Wind Blast is a slightly less lethal pistol shot. The Blink ability, however, is extremely powerful. Blink allows the player to teleport a short distance in front of themselves. It costs a very small quantity of mana to cast, and can be upgraded to go further and be faster. Enemies cannot see the player when teleporting, so blinking from cover to another hiding place can get the player deep into enemy fortifications for relatively little effort. Walls that are supposed to be unscalable become so, and sections of pickpocketing keys from guards to get into locked rooms can be avoided by blinking over the banister. Corvo isn't immune to damage while doing this, so it isn't a catch-all solution to every roadblock, but it's really close. Blinking towards an enemy also gives the player a free sword kill, even if they knew Corvo was there. Getting through the game without using Blink is possible, and playing this way prevents some dangerous scenarios from being simply teleported through. The choice to use abilities is a player-driven decision, but Dishonored offers many choices with intended gameplay for the player to experiment with. The most significant choice is whether the player will kill their foes or attempt to incapacitate them. Consequences of killing enemies include increased enemy presence later in the game, as well as a more pessimistic conclusion to the story. Preventing other guards from finding bodies is also included as a part of this challenge. So to get a good ending, the player has to leave everyone alive, never be seen, and never have a victim discovered, which is far too stringent a criteria to fill, in my opinion. Almost all of the game's locations have multiple entrances and countless routes through them, so the player has to actively choose their path as they're progressing through the level. The targets missions are centered around often have non-lethal solutions to the question of their deposition, but anyone complicit in the assassination of the non-tyrannical empress, abduction of her now orphaned daughter, and framing of the royal bodyguard have committed an act of evil so heinous that allowing them to walk free seems like the absolute incorrect decision. Of course, an assessment of evil would have to be interpreted by a person's own sense of morality, and that can be an interesting concept if the answers aren't so black and white. Disappointingly, Dishonored's narrative mostly floats atop the game, and never truly integrates with the gameplay events and objectives in a desirable way. There is this world-ending plague ravaging the city, but the two groups the plot revolves around are never affected by it at all. Magic and a godlike entity exist in Dishonored's world, but both things just orbit certain characters and never impact any plot at any stage. These are monolithic, fascinating worldly elements that aren't included in the game's narrative, and it would have categorically improved that narrative had they been, because the primary narrative of Dishonored is horrible. Corvo fails to prevent the assassination of Dunwall's empress and the abduction of her daughter. He is blamed for the death and sentenced to execution. 6 months pass while Corvo is imprisoned, and the blatantly introduced antagonist reveals all of his evil schemes to Corvo during this time. The Spy Master is so obviously behind the assassination that an organization of loyalists are willing to do very little to help Corvo in escaping prison. Once in their hideout, the Loyalists dispatch Corvo to a series of locations to remove the Spy Master's subordinates. By the third mission, the Empress's daughter is located and rescued. At the end of the second act, the Spy Master is already dead or removed. The Loyalists betray Corvo, attempt to poison him, kill all of their co-conspirators, and then begin squabbling over the throne. Corvo then goes to wherever the Loyalists had managed to take control of, witnesses their deaths, and saves the Empress's daughter. The issue is, the Spy Master wanted control of the city so he could have all of the impoverished deported. That's his motivation for wanting the Empress murdered, which is so stupid that it's beyond evil for evil's sake. You can't just have wealthy people. Who does all of the labor and buys the products? Dunwall's economy is heavily focused on harvesting whales from the ocean, a labor-intensive industry. How will that happen without a labor force? The Loyalists' desire to remove this guy from power is understandable, but once they manage that, they start tearing down the only organizational structure they had. Corvo and the two doctors are the most valuable assets the Loyalists have, but once the power vacuum opens up, they want Corvo dead and leave their doctors to be killed by guards. These are the most recognizable and intelligent people in their ranks, and they would add instant legitimacy to the new leadership. Then, when they finally begin to consolidate their power, they split the armed forces into two and immediately go to war with each other. Pendleton, whose motivations for removing the Spy Master are directly linked to the Spy Master being an idiot, has no claim to any branch of Dunwall's military, so is swiftly killed by Martin or Havelock. When confronted by Corvo, Martin doesn't even try to fight, he just shoots himself, and Havelock has somehow managed to get himself in a strange tug-of-war situation with the Empress's daughter, on a catwalk at the top of a very tall tower. He's this juggernaut of a man, and yet he can't just lift up a child. The entire main cast make unbelievable decisions at every turn, and none of it relates to the Plague or the Outsider. The Outsider is this supernatural being with the ability to bestow superpowers onto whoever he pleases. He seems to select his squires based on how entertaining it would be for them to have superpowers, and then he gives them superpowers. There is a persistent side quest to a sister character called Granny Rags. She's been having some trouble with the local gang and wants Corvo to help. This character is the only one linked to the Plague and the Outsider. She has rat-related superpowers, and the rat-related abilities are pretty unremarkable. The Plague has caused massive chaos throughout the city too. Not that the main plot is concerned at all. There is a connection, a recording of the Spy Master saying that he brought the rats in to spread disease through the poorer regions of Dunwall. And I honestly think this line was added right at the end of the development, when it came to everyone's attention that the Plague was just happening without context, so they snuck it in. Oh, and there are zombies. I forgot there were zombies. That's a lot of negativity, and while it is warranted, it only applies to the narrative, which is relatively easy to ignore. Figuring out the most effective way to sneak into these locations with absurd quantities of guards, then making a mistake and having to improvise a new strategy on the spot is always intense and leads to some wacky situations. Standing in a doorway, fencing with several guards at the same time is so silly, and I would have much preferred if the game leaned into that ridiculousness a little more. There really aren't many other games like it, and Arkane is currently the primary fountainhead for anything close. Dishonored takes the idea of player input and accelerates it to the extreme, while erroneously attempting to guide the player through a narrative. Next, I'll be shifting modes at preposterous speeds to be crowned the victor of every league. Stick around and I'll show you my moves.